Hey, welcome back to another episode of Bookworm Banter. I'm your host, Ariana, and this is the podcast where we're taking reading to the next level, one page turner at a time. From covers to chatter, we've got the books that matter. And the book that matters this week is Haunting Adeline. So I told you guys last week that I was going to read this book. And let me just say, it was hard. Getting through 583 pages, lesson learned. I am never reading a book this long again. This was treacherous, especially trying to read a book every week, a new book for you guys every week. This was impossible. I'm so disappointed in myself for even attempting to do this. I don't know what I was thinking. Haunting Adeline, 583 pages, and I think probably around page 400, I was like, okay, what are we doing here? Like, where's this going? What are we doing? Are we wrapping this up, or are we getting to a point? But all that to say, the book was good. That's what we're going to be reviewing today. Excuse my swimwear in this video, guys. I just came back from the pool. I had a quick second to do this podcast for the week. I've been super busy with so many other things, including my own book club. We're reading a completely different book. So I read 900 plus almost 1,000 pages of books just in like the last 10 days, and I'm miserable. Like I said, never doing a 600 dang near page book again. Just not gonna do it. So let's get into it. Haunting Adeline. I told you guys a little bit about what it was last week. Before we get too deep in it, y'all, I bent this book and read this book so fast and so hard, I done tore the book. Anywho, first off, I want to say, if you are a young listener or if you are not aware of what this book is about, it is very graphic. And so the things that we're going to be talking about this podcast this week is also going to be very graphic. So if you are a sensitive listener or a young listener, I would advise you not listen to this week's podcast because it has some very disturbing material. And I let you guys know that last week when I told you about that important note in the beginning of the book. It describes what kind of things are going on in the book, and it pretty much warns you what you're about to read. And like I said, I've never read a book where it has a warning, and I think it's fair because the material in this book is not only disturbing, but it's, like I said, very graphic. So if that's not something that you're interested in and you want to shield your ears from what we're about to talk about, please go ahead and listen out. Come back next week. We'll be reading a much more mild book. I'm going to be choosing from one of these books over here. So, yes, come back next week for a listen because this book, I can't imagine that this book is made for everybody. But I am going to read you, now that you've read the book, I'm going to go ahead and read the podcast what the important note says. So, important note of the book. None of these conspiracies derive from a belief in anti-Semitism or QAnon, but from my own demented imagination, common conspiracies in the media, and a many occult horror movies my dad used to watch growing up. This book ends on a cliffhanger. The contents are very dark with triggering situations such as non-dub con between the main characters, graphic violence, human trafficking, stalking, child trafficking, child sacrifice, mentions of child death, and explicit sexual situations. There are also particular kinks such as gunplay, somnophilia, bondage, and degradation. This book was previously taken down due to the warning, but you can also find them in reviews on my website or feel free to message me directly. Your mental health matters. So, when I first read that important note, I was like, I don't know if I want to read this. You know, child trafficking, sex trafficking, child abuse. I'm really, really sensitive when it comes to child abuse. I don't like seeing it in TV shows. I don't like seeing it in real life. I know that those things exist, but it just pulls at my heart cord so tough that I really was questioning on whether or not I was going to read this book, but I felt like I had already committed to myself that I was going to read this book. And so I went ahead and read it 583 pages later. And in the author's note, it's interesting that she says, like, she doesn't do short books. But in this particular instance, I wouldn't have minded if it was a shorter book. Because 583 pages, I was really like, I'm ready for this to be over. But, so I've got a few notes about the book. We're going to talk about the main characters. Main characters are going to be Addie. Gigi is Addie's great-grandmother. Nana is her grandmother. Her mom is a part of the book. Then Daya is her best friend. And Zaid is the stalker main character who is her pursuant. So, in the beginning of the book, starts out with Addie doing a book signing, and she is seen by Zaid, and he just becomes obsessed with her. She sees him through the crowd, but she's like not really paying attention because she's trying to do her book signing. She's an author, and she's in a bookstore trying to do her book signing. Zaid sees her outside, comes into the store, and he kind of just watches her and becomes obsessed with her. And so that is how they meet and how his obsession begins. He starts stalking her at her home and leaving her roses places. And a couple of interesting things. I have predictions for this book. On page 62, a main storyline for this book is Gigi, Addie's great-grandmother, is murdered in her own home by who she thinks is her stalker. So she discovers Gigi's diaries, and she starts reading them and discovers that Gigi also had a stalker. And then her mom tells her that Gigi was murdered in the house that she's now living in, that her Nana left to her, and tries to use that for a reason for her to leave the house. But Addie, being the stubborn person that she is, does not want to leave, and she just gets enthralled into this kind of murder mystery that her and her best friend Daya are trying to figure out. So on page 62, I don't know why, I usually mark the pages of when I have predictions for things because it tells me what I thought and then later what actually comes true. And doing a whole book review, your predictions, obviously you find out before you get to ever actually review. So I don't know if some of your predictions were similar for the book, but on page 62, my first prediction was that Gigi was killed by her husband John after discovering the visitor, her stalker, and their relationship, and he kills her. So that was my initial guess of who murdered Gigi. But as the story goes on, that kind of takes its own form. We'll get back to that. One interesting thing, so the character Zaid, right? He's meant to be kind of like this dark horse, this very ominous character. We don't know much about him for majority of the book, except that he just is madly in love with Addie and takes ownership of her. And if you are interested, the graphic art designs for Zaid are very interesting to look at for Zaid and Addie. So if you just Google Zaid and Addie haunting Adeline fan art, the stuff is really interesting to look at, and I think a lot of it is very accurate. It's very interesting to see everyone's perspective of what Zaid looks like. But, so, Addie's in a club, and she goes off and upstairs. This is after Zaid tells her, like, oh, I'm your stalker, you're going to be with me, no other man can touch you. So to test those limits, she goes to a club with Daya, and they meet this guy, Archie. And Archie takes them upstairs to a private room, and there's some other guys there. And Archie's like coming on to Addie strong. And so she invites him back to her house. And before all of this, Zaid texts Addie like, oh, sneaking off with random men, Little Mouse. His nickname for her is Little Mouse, which I think is so cute and kind of like very, very unique. Most couples' nicknames are like baby and, honey, things like that. But I really like Little Mouse. It's very unique. And so he texts her sneaking off with random men, little mouse. And I think at some point he texts her as well, like, if you let this man touch you, I'm going to cut his hands off and send them to you. So Addie, again, being the stubborn person that she is, she tests Zayd's limits, and she takes Archie back to her house. She's got a kind of see-through den, like a den made of glass in the very back of her house. And she takes him out there because she wants her stalker to watch her be with another man. And I think he like fingers her. And yeah, he fingers her. And before they can do anything else, they hear like a loud banging at the door. Archie goes out, guns a-blazing, like, who's out there? And then he disappears. Very next day, his hands show up on Addie's doorstep. So that's the first real sign that Zayd is going to be violent towards anyone that Addie tries to be with. And I think that was the first sign, or really the first instance where Addie started to realize, like, oh, this is serious. Like, he follows through on his words. He sent this man's hands in a box to my doorstep, and I don't want to test these limits anymore. Like, I don't think I can be with anybody else. This is going to be crazy. So I think that's the first instance where she realizes, like, Zayd means business, and she's not to test him. So another interesting thing I thought this book did was kind of made me excited for the thrill of the stalking. So the stalking part in the book for me was really interesting. For this book to have like a stalking element, it was really interesting and also intriguing at the same time, because one, Zayd is described as like this very sexy guy, very sexy kind of dangerous guy, which is kind of hot in a way. And then his obsession with Addie is crazy, but kind of like, I don't know, just kind of draws you in. And the ominous text and just the random shadows, feeling the breeze, it gets you kind of like butterfly, like anxiety, but a little bit almost in a good way, at least for me. So I did make note that I started to feel like excited for the next text message from Zayd when they finally made communication and he started texting her. I was like, oh, I wonder what the next text is going to be, and I wonder what he's going to say to her next. And I found myself getting excited for the next part of their story, and that intriguing part of the cat and mouse game. So another question. So in the book, finally Zayd approaches her at some point, and he catches her in her home, and he forces, not necessarily himself on her, but this part is wild, guys. This was, to me, the wildest part of the book, and I think for most people it would be, just because it's like, one, shocking, but two, it's like, in real life, would that even, like, in real life, are we doing that? In real life, is anyone enjoying that? So I don't know, maybe I'm a little more tame than I give myself credit. But the gun. When Zayd, this is their first sexual interaction, mind you. So Zayd comes to her, traps her in her home. They're chasing each other. He's like, if I find you, I'm going to have sex with you. And he inserts his gun into her vagina and has sex with the gun, I guess. She has sex with the gun that he's controlling, and she's enjoying it, and she orgasms from this. So when I read this, I'm thinking to myself, in real life, are there people out there? You know, everyone's got an itch, everyone's got a kink. I'm not knocking it. I'm not saying that it doesn't exist. I'm not saying that it shouldn't exist. Whatever people are into is what they're into. But just the idea of a cold metal steel something that could potentially kill you, that being thrilling, I don't know. Maybe you had to be there to to get it. But when I was reading that part of the book, I'm like, this seems like really unrealistic. So if that's something that you have heard from someone else or something you personally like, please leave that in the comments, because I would love to hear about someone's experience with that. But yeah, that just shocked me to my core. And I think even for Addie, it shocked her to her core, because she was like, I don't think I'll ever be able to tell anybody else about this or what happened that night. Like, even to herself, she can't believe what happened there. So that was really interesting. And in that specific instance, she was, trying to fight him, trying to fight back, running from him, and he was just so much larger than her. So it really made me question, like, what are you supposed to do when someone can overpower you in such a way? And it's not even overpower you physically, but like, Zaid has crazy training, like, he does this for a living. He chases people, murders people, he dominates people. That's his job. Like, that's what he does for fun. So it's not just the like everyday guy who works out who's overpowering you. This is someone mentally educated in the tactics of defense and offense. So it's like, you might think, oh, well, Addie's, she's getting aroused. She's almost allowing certain things to happen. She's kind of getting into it at some point, which is, that's questionable. But at the same time, it's like, what are you supposed to do in that situation? You kind of can't do anything but let it happen. You have no control. You have no power. And I don't know if that was something that was arousing to Addie, or if it was just, she says, or in the book, Zaid and her say that they like the thrill of being scared, and that's what's arousing. But is it the scare that's arousing, or the loss of power that's arousing? I'm not really sure. I think that's questionable. What do you guys think? Moving on. So, throughout the book, guys, there's a lot of sex in this book. Too much, in my opinion. Too much of the same thing, in my opinion. It was constantly, what they say? I don't even know how they described it. And you know what's funny? As I'm looking for this, I'm flipping through so many pages, y'all, and every other page is a sex scene. And I get it's a sex book, but like, how much sex do you really need in a book? Like, truly in reality, I don't know. So, and a lot of people enjoyed it, I guess. I don't know. But for me, it was just too much. Anywho, so I didn't find it, but yeah. They're constantly talking about how tight she is, the wetness, just dripping down the thighs. I mean, all of the things, all of the descriptions. It's like, and I do not like the word cock, y'all. I don't. And I think that's just weird, but I don't like the word cock. So that was another thing that bothered me. And I know that's kind of like something weird, like a small thing to get caught up on, but they said that word a lot. And I also didn't like that. And that's their thing, so it's whatever. But it was like, are y'all ever gonna have sex in a bed? Like, all the places that they had sex, the first place that they had sex was in a like haunted house, or the House of Mirrors, where you like go in and your reflection is everywhere. That's the first place y'all have sex, on all fours in a public place up against a mirror. I guess if that's what you're into. But then I thought after that, like, oh, okay, maybe they'll have sex in a bedroom next. And it was like, no. Then it was like in a forest, or I don't know. It was just so random, like in the car, in the forest, in the den. It was like, you do know beds exist. I mean, that seems like really, maybe that just seems really prude and really like tame for some. But I mean, every now and then, every once in a while, like, maybe use a bed. I don't know. And then also I start thinking, like, all this sex in this book, this man is ripping every piece of clothing off of her. Her bra, her panties, her leggings, her shirt, her nightgown, her jackets, anything she wearing, he just ripping them things to shreds. So I'm just like, how many pairs of these clothes do you have? Because at some point, you're going to have to start replacing this stuff. Like, she got money, but who want to be buying new panties every other week? I don't know. Maybe I'm being too practical. A pair or two ripped off is fine in the moment, but you ripping every pair of panties up the shirt. Those might have been my favorite panties. So maybe I don't know. I guess go to Walmart, buy you them $2 panties, and then this wouldn't be a problem, perhaps. But if I'm going to Victoria's Secret and buying nice panties and you just ripping them to shreds every couple of days, I'm gonna be mad. I'm gonna be very mad. However, so back to Gigi's murder. I had more predictions. On page 251, which, yes, I wrote the script, guys. And I say this because my prediction was true. On page 251, and I'm not joking, on page 251, I said, Frank the cop, who is John's best friend, killed Gigi. That was on page 251, y'all. Not even halfway through the book. I started reading it. I don't even know what I was reading. Let me see on page 251 what they're talking about. So on page 251, they don't even mention Frank. So I don't know why all of a sudden I had this, like, they do talk about Gigi's murder on page 251. And Zayd and her are talking about it. Like, did you know that that a stalker killed my great grandmother? So they're talking about that. But yeah, I don't know why. It just all of a sudden just came to me like, oh, Frank killed her. Like this. I don't know why I felt that or what in the book led me to believe that. Only 250 pages in, but yeah, I definitely was like, oh, Frank killed her for sure. What else? Oh, another prediction. Again, me writing the script. The society knows about Zayd and is roping him in to kill him, to trap him. This was on page 525. So I don't know if y'all thought this book was predictable or if I'm just that good, but I wrote the script. Y'all could have put my name on the bottom of this. H.D. Carlton and Ariana, because I knew that they knew about Zayd. And yeah, so for this book, I think a lot of interesting things took place. The most interesting storyline, for me, the most interesting storyline is difficult to say because I thought Zayd and Addie's storyline was the most interesting in the beginning of the book. As the book progressed, I felt like Zayd and Addie's relationship to me just got really tiring. Like the constant going back and forth, the constant struggle of, do I let him in? Like, we know you're gonna give in. You're gonna give in to this guy. He clearly is like super in love with you. You're clearly into him as much as you want to deny it, and he's gonna keep pursuing you. You literally can't be with anybody else because he's going to kill them. So yeah, just give in to that. Just sum that up. So the cat and mouse game was really thrilling in the beginning, and once it got to a point where I felt like there wasn't enough substance within their relationship that it kept me interested. There's a lot of sex in their relationship, a lot of like violent sex, which is cool. You know, like the choking, the biting, the thrusting, talking about, oh, it's too big, it doesn't fit. Yeah, all that stuff, that was cute for a while, but after 583 pages, I was like, okay, like, is this all they're never gonna get any deeper than this? And they start to get a little deep, like talking about Zayd's mom and why he leaves the roses, and Addie asking about what he does and things like that. But yeah, for me, the relationship just never got deep enough in this book for me to continue to be as interested in their storyline. Another storyline in the book was Gigi and Her Murder, which was very interesting to follow along. By page 251, I had a pretty good idea. I'm no detective, but I had a pretty good idea that Frank did it. And so for that to have been the case, it just verified what I already knew. The storyline was interesting still, but I don't know. Maybe I'm, like I said, I don't know if I'm just that good, but was it as easy for anyone else to kind of determine or decipher who was Gigi's murderer? Okay, guys, so we're gonna talk about the graphic parts of this book now. The sexual graphicness. The sexual parts of this book is one thing, but as you know in the important note, they mentioned the child trafficking, sex trafficking, child abuse, child murder, blah, 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 Satanism, all this other stuff. So aside from the storyline of the cat and mouse, Zaid's job, he has taken it upon himself to be a vigilante in a way and in sex trafficking. So he is a expert hacker, and he creates this company called Z, where he hires a bunch of people and they get information on sex traffickers and child abusers and child trafficking, anyone who's working in that ring of the black market, underground society stuff, and he goes and kills them. So he's made it his life mission to kill anyone involved and end child trafficking, sex trafficking, blah, blah, blah. So his part of the storyline is that he's like working this big case on trying to find an underground society who is sacrificing children and drinking their blood. And that is why he's in Seattle, to do so. So that is the majority part of his storyline. And for me, it was too much. Like, if you are listening to this review, trying to get an idea of if you want to read this book, I would not suggest this book for the timid reader. This book was a lot. So the book is a sequel. There's a sequel to this book. And if you're like me, you're saying 583 pages and they couldn't wrap that shit up, but apparently not. No, they couldn't. 583 pages and there is a sequel to it. I don't know how long that one is, but when I got to the end of this book, I thought to myself, could I go on reading about the content that's in this book? It was one thing for me to commit to reading this book, but a whole nother thing for me to commit to reading the sequel. One of which I haven't bought, one of which I didn't even know about. So yeah, after reading this book, I felt like the content was really heavy. The stalker stuff and the sex stuff, I could deal with that. But for me, the child trafficking, the child abuse, she never wrote the book in a way where it discussed really harming children in detail. It was more so like, I'm saving these kids from this. I'm going to stop this from happening to these kids. I don't want these kids to ever have to go through this, that, and the third. So it was written in a way that was mostly past tense, and the experiences they assume that these children who had been sold and trafficked would have had. But even still, like, they write like the child is screaming and asking for their mommy and, you know, wanting to go home. And I just can't, y'all, my heart, I just can't read that kind of material. So it was difficult for me to get through this book when it got to those points, because it just, I know that it exists, which makes it even sadder. Aside from that part, all of the Satanism that's in the book, I am a child of God, y'all, so not something that I really particularly want to read in my leisure. About, one thing is cults, but two, satanic rituals, sacrificing children, drinking blood, just all this crazy stuff. And I'm sure in this messed up world that we live in, like, this stems from somewhere, but I think it's a little too close for home for me, that although it is fictional writing, again, it comes from a very real place, and reading about that in my leisure is just not something I particularly enjoy. So for me, if you were interested in reading this book, I would say be very aware that the child trafficking and the satanic stuff, it's in there and it's heavy. It's not as bad as I thought it was going to be, but it's prevalent. It's not just a one instance kind of thing. It's throughout the whole book and very prevalent. And yeah, it was a lot. So that being said, guys, this is going to be a short review because I there wasn't a whole lot to say about this book. It was sex and it was Satanism, sex and child trafficking, sex and haunted houses. You know, it was just sex and this, sex and that, sex over here, sex and hacking, sex and this, sex and a book read, sex and some whiskey. It's a lot of sex and a lot of child trafficking. So I don't really know what most to say about this book. I think the most interesting character by far, obviously, is Zaid. Addie, I don't get that obsession. She seems like just your regular girl next door, but hey, whatever floats your boat. Fan art for them is super cool, guys, if you haven't taken a look. Cat and Mouse, that's the second book, so if you liked Haunting Adeline and you read Haunting Adeline and you're still watching this podcast or video on YouTube, then leave a comment and let me know what you thought of the second book. I went on Reddit because I had already decided that I was not going to be reading the second book. One of two reasons. One, because the material for me was just too heavy. I couldn't see myself reading another however many pages about the abuse and trafficking of children and women. And then secondly, I don't have this kind of time, y'all. You don't understand how rushed I felt reading this book. Trying to read a new book a week for this podcast, there is no way I can read a 600-page book comfortably within a week. And maybe it took me about 8 days to read this book. And I think a lot of that also had to do with just how heavy the material was. I found myself just, I don't know, like I was reading it, but I don't feel like I was reading it at a super fast pace like I normally do. And I don't know what other reason that would be other than one, I just felt like it was a daunting task to get through 583 pages. And I know some of you out there like, read the Harry Potter books and the Lord of the Rings books. They're like 1,000 pages each. Good for you. But for me, I don't enjoy reading that long of books. The sweet spot for me is 300 to 400 pages. So I knew I wasn't going to move on to the sequel to this book. And another thing, when they say in the warning this book leaves off as a cliffhanger, I was fine with. I'm fine with cliffhangers, kind of leave it up to the reader to interpret what you thought of the book or how you think the book ended. But nowhere on here did it say it was a sequel. Even the sequel's not named the same thing. I don't know. I wasn't expecting, and then when I bought the book, there is like this one right here. So I wasn't sure if the one was just like a part of art or if it was a part two. I guess I should have looked it up before I started reading it, but I don't know. I was not fully aware that there was going to be a book two. So I don't know. That kind of irked me because when it ended, I was like, I don't know what happened. Like I was getting to page 575 and I was thinking to myself, there's so much that still has to be wrapped up. So clearly this isn't going to be the end unless they're just going to end it like that abruptly, like they described as a cliffhanger. I don't know. But yeah, so the book ends as Addie gets kidnapped. She's wanted by the society that traffics children. So she gets kidnapped. That's how her story ends in the book. Zaid's story ends in the way that he's in the society, he's in the dungeon where they are doing the satanic child offerings where they kill the children and drink their blood. He stabs someone in the neck and then something explodes. So everybody starts running. His sidekick, I think his name is Jay, is there. And he's like, oh, they knew we were coming, blah, blah, blah. I already knew that they knew that. I predicted that. So that wasn't a huge surprise. But that's how that story ends as well. So both of their storylines are left as a cliffhanger. Daya is also left as a cliffhanger because she's like texting Addie throughout the night that she's with Zaid. And then when she finally looks at her phone, she sees Daya has messaged her a bunch. So she gets in her car, drives off to find Daya, because Daya's not answering. She's not responding to the text messages. She's not answering Addie's phone calls. And Addie says it's very unlike her, so she goes to try and find her. Addie gets kidnapped in the process. Daya very well could have been kidnapped as well. I, at first, thought that maybe Daya was behind it, because the book ends with like Zaid having a gun to his head and saying like, "Oh my goodness, you," or however it ends. Let me see. Yeah, so Jay looks up at the person standing behind me, his eyes growing impossibly larger. "You?" So at first I thought Daya, because it would make sense that she has the most access to Addie. She finally discovers who Z is. And maybe she infiltrated her way into Z, the corporation, to end Zaid and his shenanigans. So maybe she was a part of the society the whole time. I wasn't really sure, but for some reason I thought it was Daya. Like I said, I'm not going to read the second book to figure it out. So at this point of the story, y'all, that's how the book ends. There was a lot of good stuff in the book, and it's not a book that I come back to, not a book that I would suggest to someone, like I said, who is a timid reader. If you just want like a kinky book, I think there are a lot of books out there that doesn't have as heavy content as this one. So if you just want some kink in your life, like Haunting Adeline, you can find it somewhere else. Outside of the gunplay, I don't think I've ever seen that. That, to me, was just like, that was a little shock reading that. I was like, girl, get your life. Literally, get your life, because you have a gun in your vagina right now. Your life could be ended. And she just, arching her back and getting all into it. But if you wanted a book just for kink, this doesn't need to be it. A lot of people said that this book was amazing, that it was so good, but I will not be reading the second part. I wouldn't suggest this book to someone else who is, like I said, a timid reader. I also know someone who read this book who is not my friend, who said it was really good. I don't know. I don't know. Like I said, I have a very sensitive heart when it comes to the children. That's one thing I can't watch, I can't read. I just want no parts of it. I know it exists, but for the sanctity of myself and my motherhood, I just can't function in a world where I'm seeing that every day. I know it exists. I try and protect from it, but I can't function in where I'm seeing that every day. And reading this for 8 days straight, it was heavy. So ending the book, I was grateful for. Reading the second book, I already knew I wasn't going to do. That being said, if you have not read the second book, stop listening, because I'm about to spoil some things, y'all. Spoil. Because I am about to spoil the second book. And I'll tell you why. I ended up on a Reddit page, and the Reddit pretty much told me that Addie goes into being a sex slave. She becomes sex trafficked. And someone said, like, the wording and how graphic they get about her trauma and her experience being in the sex trafficking world is bad. Like, it's up there. And it's for quite a bit of the book. They said about half the book that Addie is abducted into sex trafficking. And they are very blunt and realistic about what happens during that time. And so there is very intense content about what happens there. And then Zaid goes on to his usual shenanigans, trying to end sex trafficking, trying to get Addie back, blah, blah, blah. So I don't know exactly how the second book ends. I didn't get that far in the Reddit, but just after reading those first couple of comments about how vulgar and explicit the next book was, I just was like, no, I'm good on that. So I'll probably follow up with that Reddit or trying to figure out what happens in the second book, because I'm not going to read it, y'all. If you read it, spoil it for me. Spoil it in the comments, y'all, because like I said, I'm not going to read it. But otherwise, that's going to conclude this podcast, this week's podcast, this review. If you guys like thrillers, if you don't mind the abuse and trafficking parts of the book, and if you want something very kinky, this book is a good one for you guys, okay? So, read it. Let me know what you think. Let me know what you thought. Let me know what you thought about that second book. If you want to spoil it for me, I would really appreciate it. And this array of books over here, let's see what I'm going to read. I'm not going to read You Love Me. I actually think that is based off of You, the TV show. And seeing as how we just read a stalker book, I'll probably go away from that. I'm thinking I want something a little more lighthearted. So y'all, I think, don't mind when all my books, don't judge me, y'all, because I haven't got bookends yet. All these books are about to fall. I think reading something like People Like Her, I don't really know what it's about. I'm sure I read it in the store before I bought it, but I think we'll give this a read. And the cover's on backwards. This book, ooh, The Sweet Spot. Oh, I'm definitely reading this, y'all. Okay, so this book is less than 300 pages, but this book is called People Like Her. It's a novel by Ellery Lloyd. I'm going to read you the description now, just in case you want to go out and buy it. If not, just come back next week and learn all about it. To her adoring fans, Emmy Jackson, aka the Mama Bear, is the honest Instamom who always tells it like it is. To her skeptical husband, a washed-up novelist who knows just how creative Emmy can be with the truth, she is a breadwinning powerhouse, brilliant at monetizing the intimate details of their family life. To one of Emmy's dangerously obsessive followers, she's the woman who has everything but deserves none of it. As Emmy's marriage begins to crack under the strain of her growing success and her moral compass veers wildly off course, she becomes more vulnerable to a very real danger circling ever closer to her family. In this deeply addictive tale of psychological suspense, Ellery Lloyd delves deep into the dark side of influencer culture, technology, and the way we live today. A perceptive and chilling look at the perils of parenting online. People Like Her explores our desperate need to be seen, and the lens will go to be liked by strangers. It asks what and whom we sacrifice when we make our private lives public and ultimately lose control of whom we let in. So this actually does sound really interesting, especially because I think technology, mainly social medias, has played a very large part in depression and like addictive behavior within today's society. I try and disconnect from social media as much as possible. I don't have very many personal social medias. I've got like Instagram for Bookworm Banter, but me myself, I don't really do social media, and it's for a very specific reason. I think that it just messes with your mental psyche. So reading this book, I think it's going to be really interesting. I'm really excited for this one. I know I picked it up, so I figured it would be like a good read. So we'll come back next week and read People Like Her. I'll leave the title and the author in the description in the book. In the description of this podcast. So if you've read it, come back next week and we can talk about it. If you haven't read it, pick it up and then you can still come back and talk about it. And if you're a person who just likes to hear about books and likes the spoils, then come back next week and listen to the podcast as well. This podcast is welcome to everyone, to all. Anybody who likes books or just likes the sound of my voice. So yeah, guys, thank you for coming back for another episode of Bookworm Banter. Per usual, we'll be back next week. This post might be a little late. I normally try and post on Mondays, but because this book took so long to read, I'm not even recording this until Saturday. So I've still got to do edits and blah, blah, blah. You know the drill. So it might be up a little late, but either way, I'm really glad that I got it for you guys. Haunting Adeline. Very controversial book. Controversial review. I'm on the fence about it altogether, but overall, I'm glad I read it, and I'm glad it's over. Okay? So you guys, thank you for coming back. See you next week.